Good afternoon. Let us bow our heads again and offer a word of prayer. Thank you, Lord, for your goodness and mercy. We thank you for your blessings of the past, and we claim your promise to be with us this morning and this afternoon, and that you will grant us the understanding that we need. In the name of Jesus, amen. So this lesson today is on the daily controversy, one of the most significant controversies that Adventists have had, and it happens to be over interpretation of the book of Daniel in verses probably 11 to 13 of Daniel 8. This will be the first of two because of its significance in changing the very chemistry of the Adventist church. We will be spending more time with it than we would otherwise. And also because the issue is again before us today, as it not as intensely, but it also has become a point of controversy. Now we're going to take time to give just a little background before we begin our discussion of the text that was involved in controversy. And I would first of all mention that in Daniel, the second chapter gives the vision, the dream of the king Nebuchadnezzar, in which he saw a great image with his head of gold, his breast of silver, thighs of brass, and legs of iron, and then the breaking up of the feet and toes because it involved miry clay as well as metal, as iron. Now that was, God established in that a pattern that would be followed again in the 7th chapter, where we have a lion appearing and then a bear which raises up on one side to indicate that there are two different powers involved, and a leopard with 4 wings to indicate there are 4 divisions, and the wings indicating speed, followed by what was called a great and terrible beast with 10 horns, and then of a little horn that grows out, which history shows to represent the papacy. Now in chapter 8, there is nothing in that chapter to parallel the lion or Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. It begins with a ram of 2 horns, where the bear came up on one side, indicating 2 divisions. Now we have a ram with 2 horns, representing the same power. And then in the place of the leopard with 4 wings, we have a he-goat with a great horn between his eyes, which is broken, and for it come back 4 horns toward the 4 winds of the heavens. And out of one of those winds, we find a little horn power coming up, which is the same little horn power, the same kind of description as we have in chapter 7. So this is the background for what we're going to be reading now. In beginning with verse 8 of Daniel 8, in the King James Version we read, "Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn," which refers to Alexander the Great, "was broken. And for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven." When Alexander died as a young man, only about 33 years old, There was no successor planned, and the different generals, each one determined he was going to take the place of Alexander the Great. There were as many as 7 generals at one time fighting against each other, but it soon boiled down to 4. There's the 4 that grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven, and out of one of these winds came forth a little horn, which was the papacy, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And the papacy waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts of the stars, and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Now, I have shared with you a passage in which most of the 2 groups that were in conflict were pretty well agreed on these, the first verses 8 and 9 in particular. And we will discuss the areas in which there was a difference. Beginning with verse 11, definitely it could be paganism or papacy. Yea, he, and I'm sharing now my view right now, yea, he, the papacy, magnified himself even to the prince of the host, who is Christ. And by him, and those who take the paganism view suggest that it should be from, so we can use the word from, and from him, that is from Christ, the daily sacrifice, and you'll see the word sacrifices in green. Actually, that green is to remove it, because it is not actually a part of the text. It was written, it was added, inserted by the King James authors. So that, and from him, that is from Christ, the daily, or his ministry, was taken away. Now the word sacrifice then, whenever you see the word daily sacrifice, you know that the word sacrifice is always supplied. So the daily, or Christ's ministry, was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Now please notice that the place of his sanctuary, his refers back to Christ and his ministry. So the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Now we're going to be dealing quite a lot with the word that is translated sanctuary here, which is mikdash. And so keep this in mind as we go along, that it is the place of his, that is Christ's ministry in his sanctuary, that was cast down. And an host of priests was given him against the daily. We've left out sacrifice here because it is supplied. Christ's ministry, by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Now this passage is very fitting for the papacy. And in order to understand what was involved in the conflict, I'm presenting first of all what I believe to be the biblical view, and then we'll discuss the conflict later. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, and here we put it in blue, and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, and then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, what is important is that verses 13, 14 must fit verses 10 to 12. Whatever interpretation we give, these move from verses 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 move right into 13 and 14. They all are, there is a successive stream of information. So that what we believe, what I believe, is that the passage is describing Christ and his heavenly ministry, and that place of heaven, the ministry of Christ, the place is cast down so that it appears as though what really happens in heaven is actually happening on earth, and the papacy and all of its priesthood and so forth are supposedly able to carry on the ministry that Christ alone can carry on in heaven, the ministry of the forgiveness of sin and other things of that kind. Now, this was the early pioneer view. This was the view of James White and Joseph Bates and others who developed our message. However, in 1851, Ellen White made a statement in the book Early Writings, page 74, that caused a change, that produced a change in the minds of the fellow pioneers, that is, Stephen Haskell and others, in which it caused them to change their view. Let's take a look at it. And Ellen White says, "Then I saw in relation to the daily that the word sacrifice was supplied by man's wisdom and does not belong to the text." We've already dealt with that. And that the Lord gave the correct view of it to those who gave the judgment our cry when the Union existed before 1844. Nearly all were united on the correct view of the daily. But in the confusion since 1844, other views have been embraced, and darkness and confusion have followed. Time has not been a test since 1844, and it will never again be a test. Now, whatever Ellen White is speaking about, where she mentions the correct view, whatever it is the opposite of some view that is introducing time prophecies again as a test. Now, we'll examine more closely Ellen White's concern in this statement, but it's well to keep this in mind. This is the statement that created the conflict. As a result of this statement, the leaders assumed that Ellen White was affirming Miller's view of the daily. And William Miller, as we will see why he did, but William Miller developed a concept of the daily being paganism. So paganism was the issue. Was the daily the continual service of Christ? And by the way, the word daily in the Hebrew actually simply means continual, not daily. In other words, daily is not an actual translation. It was prepared that way because the translators thought that would help people understand. So whenever you see the daily, interpret continual. Sometimes I'll be doing that here this morning, this afternoon. So we will now notice how serious a mistake the leaders made in assuming that Ellen White was identifying the correct view of those who gave the judgment hour when unity existed before 1844 was referring to Miller's paganism view. As a result, they sought to conform the Bible to Ellen White's view. And this was a very serious problem. Ellen White had always indicated that Scripture is the final test of truth. And the reason why we believe in the writings of Ellen White, okay, church leaders made a very serious mistake in assuming that the correct view that Ellen White referred to, which God gave to those who gave the judgment our message, when unity existed before 1844, referred to William Miller's view of the daily. Now, Miller's view was that the daily represented paganism. And, so the leaders, deciding that Ellen White was interpreting the daily as paganism, sought to conform the Bible statement to Miller's view instead of going back to the Scriptures and together re-examining the Bible statement, which is what Ellen White encouraged them to do. And the result of this was one of the most serious conflicts Adventists have faced. Now, later on, half century later on, we've come to 1901 to 1905. We've already discussed the conflicts that shook Adventists to the roots by the defection of John Kellogg, A.T. Jones, E.J. Wagner, and then in 2005, Ballinger. In the meantime, that conflict was prevented from dividing the church completely by Ellen White and the aging pioneers who were getting up in years by that time. By their support of the church leaders, the issue was eventually resolved. But it was during this very time of struggle, before the dust could settle, A.G. Daniels and W.W. Prescott shattered the unity again by repudiating the Miller view that the daily, or in Hebrew, ha-tamid, is paganism. Instead, they promoted the recent view of L.R. Conradi, who had just written a book on the issue, that the daily is Christ's heavenly sanctuary ministry that was usurped by the papacy, the view that we discussed a few minutes ago, and the view that the leaders originally had. In other words, 50 years later, L.R. Conradi is writing a book that establishes the view that was held by the early pioneers. The older workers declared that the new view was a bold denial of the spirit of prophecy, because they believed that early writings, page 74, that in that passage Ellen White was endorsing the Miller view, which was paganism. S.N. Haskell, one of the aging pioneers and company, he was sort of a leader of it, claimed that Daniels and Prescott were repudiating the true view of the daily, and the spirit of prophecy. In other words, they were repudiating the spirit of prophecy, and that they had committed the omega of apostasy. Very serious charges. Ellen White did reprove A.G. Daniels and W. Prescott at that time over the daily, but she did not deny or affirm their view, neither one. She reproved them for bringing in this issue at a time of crucial problems with the other men that we've mentioned, the four men Kellogg and Wagner Jones and Ballinger. And so that it was a very difficult time for them to be faced with a new controversy. But she said, regarding the daily controversy, that she had no special light. She said that it was only a small matter, and I quote her words. She says, "I am unable to define clearly the points in question." And she told the pioneers not to use her statement in early writings, page 74, as a part of their argument. And finally, she called for the discussion to cease. As a result, when she finally said it should not be discussed further, they did quit public discussion, but the issue went underground, and the actual conflict then did not cease. Now, first we want to say that the new view was not new, and you can tell from what we discussed in the beginning, the new view was actually the old pioneer view. Nor did Ellen White in any way affirm paganism view, which was assumed. O.R.L. Crozier presented the sanctuary ministry view in 1843. She said just before 1844 when they were united. Well, during that period of time, Crozier presented the view that the early pioneers accepted of the ministry of Christ in heaven. And in the 1843 chart, paganism was deleted from that chart, which was, by the way, commissioned the year before in 1842 by the Millerite General Conference, which meant that the leaders of this movement were affirming their belief in the fact that the daily was a sanctuary ministry. And this is what was changed. One of the things that was changed, there were several things, but most of them had to do with this. This then was the majority view in 1843, which was just before the disappointment. Now, Crozier presented a very extensive argument on this in 1843, which he again presented in 1846 in the extra that he published. The extra was the very thing that Ellen White was shown by God was authentic. But the pioneers were not able to see it this way. They were certain that Ellen White had affirmed Miller's paganism view, because she speaks about the unity before the disappointment in 1844. However, that unity was not evident in 43, because the General Conference commissioned a chart which would remove the paganism and several elements that related to it, so that the 1843 chart was changed to delete these things. She says the Lord gave the correct view of the daily to those who gave the judgment hour cry when union existed before 1844. Now, in our next message, we will find out more about what that meant. That has a very specific meaning, and we will see what it was. Meanwhile, let us take a look at Crozier's daily statement in 1843. The reference isn't on this slide, but it will come a little later. And this is material that was part of a paper that Froome in 1940 that he drafted on the conflict that we're talking about now, in which he presented in extensive detail Miller's position and also Crozier's. So this is Crozier's statement. And he says the very heart of the gospel was removed when the little horn took away the daily. Notice, the very heart of the gospel, this couldn't be paganism. The very heart of the gospel was removed when the little horn took away the daily or continual mediation of Jesus Christ and cast down the place of his gospel sanctuary and made it a den of thieves. He cast down the sacraments and the gospel truth to the ground and practiced the mystery of iniquity and prospered in his sacrilegious perversions. The little horn and his part of the host had indignation against the covenant. This refers to Daniel 11, which we will not have time to include, but it also deals with the daily. That is, the blood of the covenant by trampling virtually upon the Son of God and counting the blood of the covenant an unholy thing. They cast down the true doctrine of the cross of Christ, the crucified one. Continuing with Crozier's statement, the great matter be taken away was the righteousness of Christ. The unbelieving Jews set the example. Away with this man and his righteousness, and give us Barabbas, the robber, and his righteousness. Away with Jesus Christ and give us the Pope, the usurper of Christ's throne. So this would be an example that was followed by the Roman Church. The great doctrine of Antichrist is the Pope is the corrector of heretics. This was established in 538. We'll speak of that a little bit later. Then where 2 or 3 poor souls were assembled together in Christ's name, that then means at that time, in times of peril, there he would be, meaning Christ, would be a little sanctuary for them. There am I in the midst of them, Christ said. Then the papal armies would persecute them and cast down the place of Christ's sanctuary. Daniel 8:11. It decides whose sanctuary it was. In other words, this statement decides whose sanctuary it was, because it was his sanctuary, Christ's sanctuary. Only 2 personages have been introduced to whom the word his can possibly apply. One was the Pope, the other was Jesus Christ, the Prince. None will say it was the Pope, the man of sin. Therefore, it was the sanctuary of the Lord, Jesus Christ. Now take 2 passages perfectly parallel. One is his sanctuary was cast down. The other is the truth was cast down. Who can doubt the identity? The Word, the truth, was made flesh and dwelt among us, and that flesh was sacrificed for us. And that sacrifice was taken away, and that truth was cast down to the ground. Pretty extensive, and this was the portion that Froome put in his paper. As we continue our discussion, keep in mind that the most clear and precise description of the daily as the ministry of Christ has just been given to us by Crozier. Now I wanted to make note of how Miller will talk a little bit more about his actual view and how it started, but I wanted to show you how he develops this. And he develops it on the basis of a misunderstanding of Revelation 13. And the note that Leroy Froome gives us here, it says, this view of daily is inextricably tied to the interpretation of 666 as years. And then he says, note, Miller's view clearly disclosed in manuscripts in 1831, which are called A Few Evidences of the Time of the Second Coming of Christ, and then it gives the date, February 15, 1831, article number 3 on the Vermont Telegraph. His position was that the 10-horned beast from the sea, in Revelation 13, was pagan Rome, and the 2-horned beast from the earth was papal image of paganism. Then, as second or papal beast, exercised power 1,260 years, 42 months, verse 5. So, pagan Rome's period of 666 years, beginning with the League of the Jews and Romans, supposedly in BC 158, and ending at the downfall of paganism in 508, obtaining a date by subtracting, notice it's by subtracting the 158 from the 666, which is Miller's key. Now, Miller's key statement is what we will now notice. This was explanatory material by Froome. So, in the following, Froome quotes directly from Miller. Pagan Rome is the first beast. Papacy is the image of the beast. And it gives the reference there from the Midnight Cry, December 7, 1842. And then the heading that Froome has provided is Pagan Rome destroyed at the end of the 66 years. This first beast power, Rome pagan, would be taken away when his 666 prophetic days should end. And this brings us to show when those days began, and of course when they ended. They must have begun when the Jewish rites and ceremonies were in effect. For this was the sole object of paganism, to counteract the Jewish rituals and draw the Jewish worshippers into idolatry, and to blend the heathen rites with their own. And the next heading of Froome is from 158 to the 666 equals 508. If you take 158 from 666, you have 508, when paganism ceased. And by the way, did paganism cease in any years in the past? Paganism is much alive today as it ever has been. Paganism has existed all through the centuries. Christianity did develop, and the Protestant Reformation brought a focus back to the gospel, but paganism has never ceased. Then, if this be correct, and this, by the way, is Miller's statement, if this be correct, that pagan Rome began his power in the year BC 158, and was to continue 666 years, when would paganism fall in the Roman kingdom, and the daily sacrifice abomination be taken out of the way to make room for the abomination of desolation? I answer, take 158 from 666 and you will have 508. Then, in the year AD 508, paganism ceased. Now, this seems a bit strange, but remember that Miller had no way of knowing how to interpret this, because Daniel was told, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal up the vision. And then it says that it will be for till the end of time. So the vision that he's dealing with is sealed, and there are things about that vision that he couldn't understand until the seal is removed until the till the time of the end. Now, the early charts all follow Miller's 666-year interpretation. So it lists several different ones until Fitch, and number 5, is for 1843. That chart omits the 666 as years and paganism as the daily. This famous chart, devised by Charles Fitch and Apollos Hale, authorized by important Boston General Conference in June 1 of 1842, and lithographed in 1842, eliminated several previously held faulty positions and bore commendation of the spirit of prophecy. And she shows early writings, page 74. Aside from mistake in some of the figures, which she acknowledges. Thus, clearly, more than one. Should also be noted that this chart was not used in the 7th month movement. Its dates focusing on 1843 and not on 1844. And then another note, to be rightly understood, Froome says, this famous 43 chart must be compared and contrasted with other earlier charts. And the earlier charts, the most striking thing about them is the daily as paganism and the 666 figures. And Froome continues, Miller contended the period began with the league between the Romans and the Jews, when the fourth beast began his rule over the Jews and the world. Now, we could discuss that. There's some evidence that that date is not accurate, but that is really not essential to consider at this time. Now, Miller says, they all, that is the 10 kingdoms, being pagans, of course, they supported that form of worship until they were converted to the Christian faith, which happened within the space of 20 years. Clovis, the king of France, having been converted and baptized in the year AD 496, by the year AD 508, the remainder of the kings were brought over and embraced the Christian religion, which closes the history of the pagan beast, whose number was 666, which beginning 158 BC would end the beast's reign in 508, having reigned but a short time, 1 hour, said John. And then a note here that Miller's view was consistently published until 1842. His associates, under fuller study, generally came to dissent from his interpretation of 666 and its involvement. So Miller says himself in February 1844, 6 months before the Great Disappointment, and we'll notice that in a moment. So what we have here is Miller's testimony of what he believed was involved. Now, the amazing thing isn't that Miller had some ideas that were not correct. The amazing thing is how well he did generally in dealing with the Bible prophecies. His associates generally actually dissent from the 666 interpretation, and the quotation from the Advent Herald that was published in February 14 of 1844 states, in the evening, Mr. Miller lectured upon the number of the beast in Revelation. He was unusually clear, but he remarked that his Advent brethren had not generally agreed with his views of it, and that satisfied him that they had studied the scriptures for themselves and followed him only so far as they believed he was following the Word of God. Miller was a very sincere person. He did not feel hurt that his fellow leaders did not agree with him, but he acknowledged that this was evidence they were studying for themselves. This was written in the Midnight Cry, February 22, 1844, also in the Advent Herald. Now, the 508 date was questioned by Miller's first pastoral convert, which was Fitch. In his first letter to Miller, he raises this question, and this was written in 1838. Will you have the kindness to inform me by letter in what history you find the fact stated that the last of the 10 kings was baptized A.D. 508? And then it gives the source and so forth where it's going to be found. The fact is that this was not true, and it was from 508 to 538 that 3 tribes were decimated, because when in 508 Clovis designated the Pope as the head of all the churches, but there were 3 tribes that rejected the papal doctrine, the theology, and they were not pagan. They had become Christian, and they rejected the heresies of Rome. And as a result, between 508 and 538, those 3 tribes were uprooted by the roots, as Daniel predicted. They were destroyed, and they no longer exist. And so the idea that all of these were pagan tribes is not true. Actually, most of the tribes had become involved in Christianity, but they rejected the papal view of Christianity, the view that cast the sanctuary, place of the sanctuary, to the ground, and that removed the daily. Not surprisingly, the daily view of Christ's ministry became the standard SDA doctrine after the conflict of 1908 to 1910. I forgot to give you those dates. That's when the heated battle took place. In 1910, they were asked to cease their debating, but the actual debate really continued underground for another 20 years or so. And then the view that became standard was the view of Crozier. Yet a few defenders of the paganism view continued until they died. One of these was J.S. Washburn, who lived until the 1950s, and Robert Whelan became a friend of his, and they spent much time together, and Whelan shared Washburn's convictions and fanned them into flame again. It was in the 1988 Centennial Minneapolis Conference that Whelan discussed with me and urged me to believe that paganism view alone affirms our sanctuary message. How he could think this, I'm not sure, but I do believe he was sincere. He was very sincere, but he was convinced that Washburn must be right, because he was one of the individuals. He was not one of the early pioneers, but he worked with the early pioneers and was a link between the early pioneers and Robert Whelan's time. The sanctuary, Whelan pointed out to me in 1988, the sanctuary in Daniel 8:11 is not Kodesh, as it is in Daniel 8:14, where it says, "Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." That word is Kodesh. But the word in verse 11 is Mikdash. And the word mikdash, he said, does not refer to Christ's sanctuary. It refers to the pagan military bastion. In other words, it's opposite of the Kodesh, Christ's sanctuary. This paganism view robbed the message of both continuity and insight. I could not see how I could adapt myself to that, and yet, if that's truly biblical, I would have to accept it. And I was prepared for quite a long time to accept it because Bob Wieland had done something else during that period of time that caused me to sense that I have to find out for sure what the daily means and taking away is. The expression taken away actually is one Hebrew word, rum, R-U-M. And that word rum, according to Robert Wieland, has been mistranslated by King James authors, and he cited the Strong's Concordance to say that it means to lift up or to exalt, as in exalting the papal little horn. It could, if that was true, it could not refer to the papal usurpation of Christ's sanctuary ministry. And Wieland continued that the clearest modern translation of rum is to incorporate or to absorb. So for a number of months, I was in a position where I was ready to change my view if his information was sustained. It was not possible for me to have time. I was the coordinator of Native Ministries and traveling all over the United States and even up into Alaska. So I did not have time for several months. I had actually planned for some time to write a book on Daniel 8, verses 9 to 14, portraying Satan's triumph in usurping Christ's sanctuary ministry and his ultimate defeat in the judgment. In other words, this was going to be the theme of the book. And I knew that I could not write that book if Wieland was correct. But in the following spring, in 1989, when I finally was able to do the research, I found overwhelming evidence that the sanctuary did indeed refer to Christ's sanctuary, that the daily was the ministry of Christ in the sanctuary. Now, let us note the passage from Daniel itself, from verses 10 to 12. And it, paganism, that is the papacy, it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by or from him the continual was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And an host was given him against the continual. Now I've changed from daily to continual because that's what it actually means. By reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Now whatever the it is, speaking of, which begins in verse 10, whatever that it is that waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them, it was that same one that cast the truth to the ground. And that whole passage then must be related to the passages that follow, verses 13 and 14, which we will notice now. The question came in verse 13. After these statements are made, the question and its answer came in the next two verses. And it is very important that we recognize this sequence, and that 13 and 14 is a part of 10 to 12. This is not only essential to logical progression, it is also required by the fact that the major items of verses 10 to 12 are compacted in the question of verse 13 as answered in the heavenly sanctuary cleansing of verse 14. Contrary to the claims of Ford and Whelan's convictions, verses 10 to 12 portray the centuries-long papal attack on Christ's heavenly sanctuary. They do not refer to paganism. They refer to the attack of the papacy not on paganism, but upon Christ's ministry. This not only denies the paganism view, but it repudiates the Ford-Whelan claims that this leads to the Antiochus view. The claim that Ford made, that Whelan has repeated, is that the reason why he gave up our sanctuary message was because of our view of the daily being Christ's sanctuary ministry. It's impossible that this was the reason, and by the way, I had the privilege of dealing with Desmond Ford's views in my doctoral dissertation, so I've had a very close contact with that. Now notice that the symbolic sanctuary view that focuses on heaven. The other view, the Antiochus view, is a literal view. The symbolic view has one day for a year. The literal view has each day for a day. And while the symbolic view of the sanctuary points to heaven, the other points to earth. And it focuses on the earthly Jewish temple. There is nothing about the sanctuary ministry of Christ in heaven that would in any wise encourage the Antiochus view. In fact, it's the best antidote to it. Now, I mentioned before that Whelan pointed out to me that the word in verse 11 is mikdash, not kodesh, where it speaks of what is translated as sanctuary in Daniel 8:11, that it was mikdash, and that in 8:14, where it says, "Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed," that's kodesh. Therefore, he said, these are opposites. They are not the same thing. But if mikdash is a pagan military bastion, as he believed it was, then there is no prior reference to the sanctuary of verses 13 and 14. Now notice, that means that verses 13 and 14 just appear, have no relationship to what went before. And obviously connected passages have no unity and no meaning. Nor has the question any meaning if it does not relate to the problem. So the question is a question about the problem. Until how long will this last? What is this? Well, the taking away of the daily and so forth. Now, if that daily is paganism, then it has nothing to do with Christ's sanctuary ministry. In 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Thus, Kodesh sanctuary, most crucial element in Daniel, would appear suddenly from nowhere as the Mikdash, the pagan bastion, simply disappears. It has no more discussion ever. So this does not seem very likely. Now let's ask a few more questions about Mikdash. And noting first of all the passage, yea, he, according to them, pagan Rome, magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and from him, from pagan Rome, the daily or paganism was taken away as absorbed by the papacy. And the place of his, that is, pagan Rome's sanctuary, or its Mikdash, was cast down. Now, from what point would the sanctuary of paganism be cast down? Christ is obviously the prince, not paganism. From Christ, the daily, the continual, was taken away, not from paganism. Mikdash cannot mean Rome's military bastion, for in the very next chapter that explains chapter 8, Daniel is praying and does not understand what is actually the passage that is the vision he has just had, but he is very worried about the temple in Jerusalem that is in desolation, and he says, "Cause your face to shine upon your Mikdash, which is desolate." Now, in this case, even though the heavenly sanctuary is not the same as the earthly, it is the earthly that is a symbol of the heavenly, and Daniel is identifying his vision with the temple of God, not with paganism. So the question is, if Daniel prays, "Make your face," who is the your? This would be God. "Make your face, Lord, to shine upon your Mikdash," not paganism Mikdash, but your Mikdash, which is desolate, which the Babylonians had desolated. Now the question is, whose then is the Mikdash? Does the Mikdash belong to paganism? Does it represent the pagan bastion? Or is this Christ's Mikdash? And who made it desolate, and how? Well, I've already mentioned that. It was Babylon that made the temple in Jerusalem, which is a symbol of the sanctuary in heaven, desolate, and a symbol thus of the sanctuary ministry of Christ. Now, did the papacy take away paganism from Rome, or did it take away from Christ his heavenly place of his sanctuary ministry? History shows us that the latter is true. There is no way in which the paganism ceased as a result of the papacy. Paganism and papacy both exist today, side by side. And if the papacy took away Rome's military bastion, how did it do it? And by the way, that military bastion that he speaks about was transferred from Rome to Constantinople in 330, long before 508 and 538, 200 years before. So if the papacy took away Rome's military bastion, how did it do it? It was already taken away. It was already transferred to Constantinople. And would you call taking something away that was given to you? If I were to give you something, you would take it, but you wouldn't say, "Well, I took it away." Now, the taking away in Daniel obviously speaks of something bad that has happened. The taking away is not just the receiving of a gift, it's the removal of a ministry. Now, how does this relate to the casting down of the Kodesh, which is mentioned in verse 13, and the casting of the truth to the ground, as mentioned in verse 12? Was paganism itself the truth that the papacy cast down? No. Or was, if the place of Christ's ministry that the papacy cast to the ground. How can you cast down to the ground something that is not already up, presumably in heaven? Was the place of paganism in heaven? Was it cast down from heaven? The answers, of course, are obvious. But the real issue comes to how the verse 13 and relates to verse 14. Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And how do these relate to verses 10 to 12? And again, I read the earlier, that is verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, until when will the vision be concerning the daily, that continual, and the transgression of desolation, to give both the Kodesh, and I put this instead of sanctuary, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled under foot. And this was Kodesh. Now, if verses 11 and 12 are speaking of Mikdash, and if that's a pagan bastion, then why is the question, how long will it be that the Kodesh is cast down? If Mikdash is not a synonym of Kodesh, then there is nothing to connect verses 10 to 12 with 13 and 14. This question suddenly come. However, this is a bit confusing because nearly everything else listed in verses 10 to 12 is again listed in the key elements in verse 13's question. If they were involved, then why would it not be the sanctuary be of Mikdash, which is, in other words, why would it not be the same as Kodesh? If they are not synonyms, what relation does the answer have? What relations do the question and answer have to the problem? There is none. Therefore, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed, as left hanging in the air with no connection with the rest of Daniel. The Hebrew word translated cleansed, by the way, is important because it is a word that contains many different meanings, and the key meaning of that word is to set right or to put in its proper place. If we were to speak about this being put right or put in its proper place, what meaning would we have in the paganism view? Would this mean putting paganism in its rightful place? Well, the rightful place of paganism would be destruction, but it didn't destroy. But the putting right and putting in the proper place of the sanctuary would mean a great deal. So which view is consistent with the text in its context? The papacy takes away or absorbs either paganism or Christ's heavenly sanctuary from the minds of people. Which is it? Is it paganism that takes away from the minds of people? No, it incorporates that paganism and presents it as Christian doctrine. And it, papal horn, waxed great, even to the host of heaven. Now we'll notice a little bit about that even, but you'll notice that it's something wrong with that. I purposely tried crossing it out. So that means that that's being X'd out. And papal horn waxed great to the host of heaven. And he cast down some of the hosts and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Yea, he, the papacy, magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And from Christ, the prince, the daily, that is, his continual ministry was taken away. and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. In this particular case, it's Mikdash. Note that in the King James Version, in verse 10, the word even is inserted. It is not there in the original text, and that's why I blotted it out. It's not even in the Hebrew. Unfortunately, they put it there because they thought it would make more sense. But it actually reduces the real emphasis in the next verse, verse 11, where even to the prince of the host is there and is vital. So we find he magnified himself to the prince to the host and cast some of them down. But he even went so far as to magnify himself to the prince of the host, the horn that waxed great to the host of heaven, not only cast down some of the hosts and stars to the ground, but magnify himself even to the prince of the host. And this is as the Hebrew has it. The prince is Christ and has nothing to do with Antiochus. And the claim that the sanctuary view causes us to reject the sanctuary message and to take the Antiochus view is just reverse. Actually, it's what would help us to continue. So Desmond Ford did not give up the sanctuary message because of our view on the heavenly sanctuary. He could not, if he had a proper view of it, he could not. It would have given him the basis for withstanding the Antiochus view, which he did accept. The papal view has nothing in common with the view in which Antiochus is the prince. And by the way, the paganism view logically should be saying that the prince is Antiochus, but they do not, because those who hold that view do believe in Christ's ministry. They do in spite of the confusion of the passage. Yea, papal Rome magnified himself even to the prince of the host, Christ, and from him, from Christ, his continual ministry was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. This harmonizes with Gabriel's explanation of the 70 weeks in chapter 9 that are cut off from the 2300 days of 814. The 70th week began with the anointing of, quotes, Messiah the Prince in AD 27, and this is found in Daniel 9, 24 to 27. The Prince of the Host, identified in 8:11, is the same as the Messiah the Prince in 9:24. His AD 31 death in the midst of that week, which was 31 AD, initiated his continual ministry. So when Christ left this earth and went to heaven, he was able to continue his ministry in heaven on the basis of the sacrifice he had just made. So he's so cast down, the papacy so cast down the ministry, or the place of the sanctuary, I should say, that for centuries, millions, and almost virtually every Christian believed that the sanctuary is the earth. Even Miller and his followers were deprived of this understanding and would be until the seal that God commanded to be placed on sealing up the vision would take place. So understanding could not take place until Daniel 8's vision was unsealed. The crucifixion sets a seal upon the vision, according to Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks, Daniel 9:24 says, are cut off. Actually, the King James says determined, but the Hebrew is cut off. 70 weeks are cut off for your people and for your holy city. This is the holy city of Jerusalem. To finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, which Christ did in his death, to bring in everlasting righteousness, which he did in his resurrection, to seal up the vision and prophecy. What vision and prophecy? Well, it must refer to chapter 8 and the sanctuary vision and the vision that we have been just talking about, and to anoint the most holy. The papal captivity and discovery of the sanctuary truth by Hiram Edson the morning after the Great Disappointment unsealed this vision so that people could understand it as they couldn't before. For us to go back to a paganism view is to move from light to darkness. Miller did the best he could, but there was no possibility for him to understand because he did not understand the sanctuary. Christ's baptism then and his death set a seal of certainty on the daily, which is a part of the 2300 vision. It tells us there in Daniel 12:4, shut up the vision until the time of the end, which was in 1798, the end of the 1260 years of papal supremacy. The Pope's 1798 captivity unsealed the time and stimulated Bible scholars around the world to study Daniel 8:14. But that unsealing of the place of his sanctuary did not begin until 1843, when Crozier identified the place of Christ's sanctuary as a daily in his ministry in heaven. Thus 1843 chart left off the daily as paganism. But the place cast down was not itself unsealed until the morning after the disappointment. Otherwise there would have been no disappointment. If they had understood that the sanctuary to be cleansed was on heaven, not on earth. And by the way, the cleansing, the word cleansing is a wonderful word because it actually defines a number of things, all of which are involved. One of them, by the way, the Septuagint does have cleansed here, and that's what KJV is following. But the word cleansed is not the most dominant. The most dominant is to replace, put it back in its proper place. If the sanctuary, the place of the sanctuary is cast down, what is its proper place? Back in heaven. So it was in the morning after this appointment that the believers were shown by this vision of Hiram Edson, of Christ in heaven, his heavenly sanctuary, and for 3 months he and Crozier and Dr. Hahn studied the sanctuary, and that was the basis of Crozier's 1846 article that we referred to earlier.
Pastor, can the word restore work too?
Restore would be another word, yes. Restore, actually it has a broad field of meanings, and set right is really a sort of a central thing. But if we had a word for righteousify, to make righteous, that would be a perfect one. Righteousify, but we don't. That's not a word. But to make righteous, to put right, to put it in its proper place. All of these have meaning in terms of the cleansing of the sanctuary. The pagan view ignores dozens of Old Testament references to the sanctuary and its ministry as the continual. Indeed, there are many. I've said dozens. I didn't take time to count them all. I would say that I could easily have written down here, instead of dozens, I could say well, probably hundreds, but at least dozens. And with no Old Testament or New Testament evidence for paganism, its promoters insist that daily taken away is paganism, as absorbed by the papacy, thus repudiating the self-evident that the daily or continual refers to Christ's own heavenly ministry, continual ministry. Day and night, it matters not when. He is constantly there. That was taken away. Now, was it removed? Did Christ's ministry itself removed? No. But it was taken away from the minds of the people, and as far as even Miller was concerned, he was thinking of the earth as a sanctuary. So the place of his sanctuary is heaven, and it was cast down to this earth. And by a power claiming the authority on earth for the sinful priests to perform a heavenly ministry that would be restored in 1844 at the end of the 2300 years. This is actually a single issue then that we're dealing with. The daily and the place of his sanctuary are one issue. The daily meaning the ministry of Christ, the place of his sanctuary where that ministry takes place. The daily could not be understood until the truth of the place of his sanctuary was restored, which Daniel himself speaks of. But in Revelation 10 and 12, we find evidence of that restoration. I will not have time to deal with that now, but it shows a transition from the little book that was shown in Christ's hand that would be so sweet in their mouth and bitter in their belly, was the message of the sanctuary. Why would it be bitter in their belly? Because of disappointment. But the next verse immediately says, you must prophesy again. And there was given unto me, verse 11:1 says, a reed like unto a rod. And the angel stood saying, rise, measure the temple of God. Now, if you're going to measure something, you have to know where it is. And the last verse of that chapter says the temple of God was open in heaven. So we know from that very passage where to measure in heaven. So the measuring has to be the understanding of its meaning. And the passage then of Daniel 8, verses 9 and onwards through 14, shows that whereas Satan is triumphing through the centuries, that in the judgment he would be condemned and his dominion taken away and given to Christ and his saints. Now just one more reference to Mikdash as not being a pagan bastion, but a synonym of Kodesh. Mikdash, as pagan Rome's military bastion, not only cuts off Mikdash problem from the Kodesh question, and also its 2300-day Kodesh answer. Remember, verses 11 to 12 speak of Mikdash. Verses 13 and 14 both speak of Kodesh. Now, if Kodesh is not the same, and by the way, King James translates them both sanctuary, and throughout Scripture, they're both translated sanctuary. In fact, the usage in Scripture is about equal, Mikdash and Kodesh. But the question, it relates directly to the problem that has been described about this terrible power. And its answer is also Kodesh, which identifies the two as the same. Until when? And by the way, in King James it says how long, but the Hebrew actually has the idea of until when the vision. The focus is not on the length of time, but at what point will this stop? When will this stop? Until when the vision concerning, notice, the continual, the daily, and the transgression of desolation, all of these things being just recited in 9 to 12, to give both the sanctuary, Kodesh, and the host that is mentioned in Daniel 8, verse 10, I think it is, to be trodden underfoot. Paganism has no basis for the question or its answer. Until the 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed, is a perfect conclusion for the concept of the papacy taking away Christ, the place of Christ's ministry, and causing people on earth to think that the Roman Catholic Church, the papacy, could do the work of Christ that is done only in heaven. So, most Mikdash elements of the problem reoccur in the Kodesh question and answer. Thus, the parallel between the little horn factors prove Mikdash to be a synonym of Kodesh, Christ's ministry. But what of the claim that is made that it is impossible to cast down Christ's sanctuary? Brother Robert insisted to me, well, it's impossible for them to cast down Christ's sanctuary. That he couldn't go to heaven to get it and be cast down if he was there. Now, the fact is, it doesn't say he cast the sanctuary to the ground. It said the place was cast down. But if the place of the sanctuary is cast down, it has to be in the minds of people. And if that is cast down, they consider the earth to be the place, not heaven. And this is what happened for hundreds of years. The argument he gave to me was that Christ's ministry always continued, and through it alone all the saints of the ages were saved, and that there were actually saints saved throughout all the ages, and those who were saved by faith in Jesus, not in a ritual, Roman Catholic ritual. He did indeed then continue his ministry. This is Christ, through which alone we are saved. But the papacy did cast the place of the sanctuary to the ground when he cast the truth to the ground. So, to cast the truth about the sanctuary to the ground explains what it means to cast the place of the sanctuary to the ground. And that truth was the truth regarding the sanctuary in the minds of all. Even the worshipers, even true worshipers, must wait until 1844 for its restoration, so that even Miller and all of his followers had to wait until the disappointment took place in order to be focused back again. So until when the daily taken away unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be put right. Only then would we know about where the sanctuary was. Now, just a quick review here. This just shows how the different elements of verses 10 to 12 relate to verses 13 and 14. But we won't take time to read them all, but notice it begins with the host in heaven, which are cast down, some of the host and of the stars and so forth, and trampled upon them. Notice they were not only cast down, but trampled upon. He magnified himself even to the prince of the host, etc. Now, the last part, it says he cast the truth to the ground and it prostrated and practiced. So these elements, 7 elements, appear again in the question, but in various orders. They're not in the same order. Then I heard one saint speaking, until when, the little horn vision concerning the daily, or the continual, that's D from above, the transgression of desolation, F, the Kodesh, the sanctuary, and the priest, that we E, C and E, and then A, the host. We begin with the host. To be trodden, that's B. And then it said to me, and in 2,300 days then shall the Kodesh be cleansed. That's G. If G is not the same as the sanctuary, which is Mikdash up here, then there's no correlation between these passages. Please note that there were several things that the little horn did. Took away the daily. It exalted himself to the hosts and cast some of the hosts and the stars to the ground. It exalted himself to the prince of the host. The place of his sanctuary, this happens to be Mikdash, was cast down, and the truth of the sanctuary was cast down. Now, I'm going to pass on to noticing that Christ then is the prince. And this accepting Christ as the prince rules out totally Antiochus Epiphanes. The Antiochus view has Antiochus as the prince. The two cannot be the same. This is a symbolic view of the heavenly sanctuary subverted by a papal little horn that could not have led forward to his literal preterist view of Antiochus as the little horn. How could viewing Christ lead us to accepting some earthly prince as the meaning? Our papal little horn view requires a day for a year interpretation, while the Antiochus view demands a day for a day view. And even then, by the way, there has never been no scholar who has attempted to defend the Antiochus view has ever been able to fit the times. They may become fairly close, but they're never the same. Nor does, as I say, this doesn't compute. They can't compute it right. Moreover, the symbolic heavenly sanctuary view honors the 1,290 days of Daniel 12 setting up and the 1,260 years of papal domination, just as does the paganism view. Now, the paganism view proponents insist that only paganism gives us an understanding of the 1290, and that's not true. It is not true at all. Anyway, we've dealt with that. Would Daniel focus on a pagan assimilation that took place centuries before 538 to introduce an 1844 focus, leaving the climax of this prophecy and of the entire book unannounced, and suddenly switch from an AD 330 pagan transition to 1844 and the cleansing of Christ's sanctuary, and refer no more again to paganism? This would be a strange thing. Now, there's a lot in this question. It's too long a question probably to really hold. But the question that it really involved two different things. The assimilation of paganism by the Roman Church did not take place in 508 to 538. The assimilation took place from the 2nd century on down to the 5th century, which is the 400s. Virtually all of the papal heresies developed in that period of time, long before 508. What happened in 508 was that the French king, Clovis, who was in close relationship with the emperor gave his authority to the to the Pope to control the Bishop of Rome, to control all of Christendom. Now that's what took place in 508. But the Pope could not control all of them because a number of them had become Christian and had repudiated the heresies of the papacy. And therefore they were enemies of the Roman Catholic system, which imposed all of this transfer to the earth and so forth. But why is 508 important? Because that was when he was officially declared to have the authority, the power over all of Christendom. But it took 30 years, and Belisarius, the general, to subdue. 3 of those tribes had to be wiped out completely because they refused to give up. The rest of them, seeing what happened to the 3, submitted. But during that period of time, it was not against the pagan, it was not paganism that was being overthrown, it was the true gospel that was being overthrown by the papacy under the power of the Roman government, which was using its armies and so forth to persecute and to force these different state nations into subservience. Now, the 330 happens to be the point where they talk about the authority transfer. And that took place in 330, 200 years before, in which the power of Rome was shifted to Constantinople. More serious, to identify Mikdash as a pagan bastion only to call the Mikdash God's sanctuary, as it does, as Daniel does in 9:17, in explaining chapter 8, as he prays about the 2300-day Kodesh vision. Daniel no doubt thought that the sanctuary cast down was the earthly sanctuary, as he prayed, "Cause thy face to shine upon thy Mikdash, thy sanctuary, which is desolate for the Lord's sake." This is not paganism. This is the Lord's sanctuary, the typical sanctuary, the temple. His language is right out of the very Mikdash passage that is identified as paganism above. Clearly, Daniel did not see Mikdash as a pagan bastion, but Christ's Kodesh, place of which the papacy was cast down and desolated the sanctuary and cast down the truth to the ground. And in verse 12, thus a host of papal priests in transgression was given to the papacy against the continual ministry of Christ, and the papacy cast the truth of the sanctuary to the ground and practiced and prospered. Friends, it is very important for us to understand that there is a battle between heaven and earth, a battle between Christ and Satan, a battle between Christ's people and those who are serving Satan and seek to destroy God's work done, God's truth. And Daniel 8 is the passage which perhaps more clearly than any other portrays how that battle would go against God's people through the centuries. And finally, that sanctuary would be put right. God would triumph, and Christ and his people would be exonerated in the judgment that condemns all evil, including the papacy. Shall we pray? Father, thank you for your goodness and mercy. I pray that you will help us to understand Daniel 8 more clearly, that we may understand the role of the continual, and that we may understand that you have today a message to put right, to exalt the heavenly sanctuary. And we ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.